He took the bar. Just the bar? Just the bar. The junior proctor beside her said it again like the second saying might change the readout, and Overseer Dross did not answer, because she was still watching the man walk away from the selection wall as though he had done nothing worth remarking on at all. The cauldron proving had been administered without interruption for 311 years. Among the Concord's 40-odd member species, it was the oldest continuous evaluation of its kind, and the most respected precisely because it could not be bribed, rehearsed, or gamed. The design was almost insultingly plain. A single candidate was inserted into a controlled hazard environment with a hard clock, and at the end of that clock the candidate either walked out or was recovered by the standby team, and in either case a score was computed from telemetry, environmental interaction, and whatever record of the experience the candidate chose to bring back with them. There were no proctors inside. There was no assistance. There was no early exit that did not also end the attempt. What made the proving prestigious was not that it was dangerous, though it was. It was that the candidate faced it with exactly the resources they had chosen for themselves, and nothing they had not. Before insertion, each candidate walked the selection gallery and drew their lotus out from a fixed catalog of 100 items. The catalog was not a suggestion, it was a boast. It held everything the Concord's finest fabricators could produce for a person about to be dropped into a place actively trying to kill them. Sealed environment suits rated for vacuum and for crush depth both, medical arrays that could stitch a severed limb and keep the owner conscious enough to thank them. Autonomous scouts, cutting lances, gravitic anchors, ration synthesizers that turned rock dust into something a body could burn. The gallery was lit so that every item threw its own small pool of light onto the long dark table. And candidates were known to stand in that gallery for the better part of a day, moving from pool to pool, weighing, discarding, reconsidering, building the version of themselves that would survive. The standing record belonged to a Braxton duelist who 40 years earlier had taken 52 items into a collapsing thermal trench and come out with not only her life but a complete geological survey, 2 previously undocumented mineral strata, and a proposal for a mining concession that the Concord had actually acted upon. She had scored higher than anyone before or since. In 311 years, no candidate on record had taken fewer than 9 items, and the ones who took 9 were spoken of afterward, the way people speak of a bridge they once crossed in a storm. The human's name was Isaac Renner. He was 34 years old. According to the file that had crossed Overseer Dross's desk 2 weeks before his arrival, he had spent the previous 11 years as a deep salvage rigging technician working the wrecks and dead platforms in the human outer belt, which the file translated imperfectly as a person whose job was to go into structures that had already failed and pull value out of them before they finished failing. He had no formal survival credential the Concord recognized. He had no military service. He had applied to the proving through the general intake channel, the one nobody staffed because nobody expected it to be used, and he had funded his own passage to the Cauldron facility because the Concord did not reimburse travel for candidates from species it had not anticipated would apply. Dross had read his file twice. Salvage technician, 11 years. A clean safety record in an industry that measured its people's careers in near misses. Nothing in it had prepared her for what she was now watching on the gallery feed. The selection gallery was a chamber the size of a maintenance hangar, and Isaac Renner had walked into it. Glanced once down the long table the way a man glances at a menu he already knows he isn't ordering from, and started walking. He did not stop at the environment suits. He did not stop at the medical array, which 4 candidates out of 5 took first and cradled like a newborn. He walked the length of the table at an even, unhurried pace with his hands loose at his sides, and his eyes moved over each item with the particular flat attention of a person confirming an absence rather than searching for a presence. He reached the end. He turned around. He walked back a third of the way, to the section the catalog listed under manual implements, the section most candidates skipped entirely because it held the things a fabricator could make in its sleep, and he picked up a salvage bar. It was not an exotic object. It was a meter of forged alloy, flattened and beveled to a chisel at one end and drawn to a curved claw at the other, the kind of tool that existed in some form on every world that had ever built anything, and later needed to take it apart. It weighed as much as a full ration crate. It did nothing on its own. It had no power cell, no edge worth the word, no display, no seams that opened onto anything clever. Isaac Renner weighed it in one hand, turned it once so the light ran down the shaft, and carried it to the selection register. He pressed his palm to the plate. The gallery display resolved. Selection complete. 1 of 100 items chosen. For a moment, the chamber held the specific silence of a room in which a number of people have all seen the same thing and are each independently waiting for someone else to explain it. Overseer Dross, watching from the observation deck above the gallery floor, heard herself say the words aloud, mostly to hear whether they sounded as strange spoken as they felt to think. He took the bar, just the bar, and the junior proctor beside her said it back. And neither of them moved, because down on the gallery floor Isaac Renner had already shouldered the salvage bar like a man carrying a length of pipe across a job site, and was walking toward the insertion corridor, with the ordinary purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere to be and expected the walk to be uneventful. The hazard environment for the current proving cycle was a derelict. The Concord seeded its proving grounds from decommissioned assets, and this cycle's ground was the hulk of a Threll deep void freighter that had died 40 years earlier and been towed, gutted, and sealed into the Caldron evaluation volume. It was a genuinely miserable place to be alive in. Whole sections of the hull had lost pressure integrity, so the interior was a patchwork of atmosphere and vacuum, separated by bulkheads that had themselves begun to fail. The freighter's reactor had not been fully cold when it was mothballed, and pockets of residual radiation drifted through the lower decks on the ship's own slow tumble. Coolant had flooded 3 of the aft holds, so those compartments were now flooded chambers of near-freezing fluid you could not see the bottom of. The structure groaned and shifted on a roughly hourly cycle as the tumble redistributed stress, and things that had been securely fastened for 4 decades chose their moments to come loose. And somewhere in the middle decks, the standby team's pre-insertion sweep had confirmed. A Threll rendering worm had gotten aboard at some point during the tow and made a home in the dark, a blind, segmented thing, the length of a transit car that hunted by pressure and by the electrical signature of a living nervous system. And that had grown large on 4 decades of whatever it could find. None of this appeared to trouble Isaac Renner in any way a monitor could detect. He confirmed his loadout at the insertion lock: 1 salvage bar, the work clothes and heavy boots he had arrived in, a canvas belt with nothing on it, and accepted the drop without requesting the environmental consultation every candidate was entitled to, and nearly every candidate used. The lock cycled. The hatch opened onto a dark corridor with a floor tilted 6 degrees off level. He clicked the bar's claw once against the deck, listened to the sound it made and to the sound the ship made back, and stepped inside. What followed was 60 hours that Overseer Dross came to watch in fragments, because the monitoring system flagged Renner's location for anomalous activity on a rhythm that, by the 2nd day, she had stopped finding. Each time a flag came up she pulled the segment, and each time she watched it, she needed a moment afterward to reassemble her understanding of what a human salvage technician considered a reasonable response to a given situation. Hour 3. He had not moved toward the core the way candidates moved, mapping outward from the insertion point in cautious loops. He had gone straight down. The freighter's schematic, which he had not been given, described a spinal access shaft running the length of the ship, and he had found it by reading the corridor's construction, by the way the deck plates were laid and the conduit was routed. And he had gone down the shaft hand over hand in the dark, using the salvage bar hooked over each rung of a ladder that had rusted through in a dozen places, testing every rung with the bar before he trusted it with his weight. When a rung failed anyway, he was already braced for it, hanging by the bar's claw off the one above, and he found the next foothold without any visible urgency and kept going. He was not moving fast. He was moving in a way that made speed unnecessary, and Dross realized, watching, that she had never actually seen anyone do that. Hour 7. Light. He had none, and he had refused the item that would have given him some, and by hour 7 he had none, because he had never intended to carry any. What he had done instead was find the Threll's emergency chemical illuminators, the sealed rupture tubes every hull of that class carried at the junctions, most of them long dead, and he had located the few that still held charge by tapping his way along the bulkheads with the bar, and feeling through the metal the faint difference in resonance between a dead tube and a live one. He cracked 3 of them across the first day, and rationed them like a man who understood exactly how little he had. He did not waste light on comfort. He lit a space, read it, memorized it, and moved into the dark before the light was gone, so that most of the 60 hours he spent inside that ship, he spent unable to see his own hands, navigating by touch and by the map he was building and holding entirely in his head. Hour 14. The first flooded hold. The direct route to the core ran through one of the coolant-flooded compartments, and the coolant was cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. A candidate with a suit would have walked through it. Renner did not have a suit. What he did instead took Dross 2 viewings to fully understand. He did not try to cross the flood. He climbed above it. He used the salvage bar to work loose a run of overhead conduit, swung himself up into the exposed structural cavity in the ceiling, and traversed the entire length of the compartment through the crawlspace between the deck he was over and the deck above, wedging the bar into gaps to make handholds where the structure gave him none, moving through a space not built to be moved through by anything the size of a person. It took him 90 minutes to cross a compartment he could have walked in 3. And he did it without once touching the fluid. And he came out the far side dry and steady, and immediately sat down in the dark for 6 minutes to let his forearms recover before he went on, because he understood the difference between speed and survival better than the ship's designers had understood either. Hour 22 came the flag Dross had been dreading since the sweep report, and it came at the worst possible time, which she would later understand was not chance, but the exact reason the worm had survived 40 years in that dark. The Threll-rendering worm found him on the middle decks, in a long straight cargo run where there was nowhere to climb and nowhere to hide, and it found him because he was alive. And it had learned, over 4 decades, that alive was the only thing in that ship worth crossing distance for. Dross watched the segment 3 times and then twice more, and each time her people gathered a little more tightly around the console without anyone deciding to. The worm came out of a side hold behind him at a speed nothing that size should have managed, and Isaac Renner heard it or felt it through the deck, and did not run, which was the first thing that saved him, because running was exactly what its pressure sense was built to track. He went still. He pressed himself flat into the angle where the deck met the wall, and he went so still that for a long moment the worm, casting for the vibration of a fleeing thing, lost him entirely and hunted past him down the corridor, its blind head sweeping the dark a body length from where he lay not breathing. And then the ship groaned its hourly groan and shifted, and a loose panel somewhere gave a metallic bark, and the worm whipped back toward the sound toward him, and there was no more note being found to be done. What Renner did in the 4 seconds after that, Dross replayed at quarter speed and still felt she was watching something faster than she could follow. He did not attack it. A man with a salvage bar attacking a creature that massed 40 times his weight was a man about to die. And he knew it, and he did the opposite. He got the bar's claw under the edge of a cargo lock in the deck, a heavy magnetic seal that had held a container in place before the container was gone, and he threw his whole body against the bar and levered the seal, and the sudden shriek of tortured metal, and the burst of stored electrical charge as the ancient lock discharged was a scream in every sense the worm possessed. It recoiled from it. It was for one instant a blind animal that had been shouted at from a direction it did not expect, and in that instant Renner was already moving, not toward safety, but toward the one thing in the corridor he had clocked on the way in and filed away without seeming to, a pressure hatch to a vented section, a doorway with vacuum on the other side of it. He got the bar into the hatch's manual override, and he cracked it, just cracked it, a hand's width, and the corridor's atmosphere began to scream out through the gap into the dead cold vacuum beyond, and the worm, a creature that navigated the world by pressure, was suddenly in a corridor where the pressure was rushing violently toward a single point, and everything its senses told it about where things were became a lie. It thrashed toward the failure. Renner had already gone the other way. By the time the standby team's telemetry caught up with what had happened, he was 2 compartments back, sitting in the dark with his back against a bulkhead and the bar across his knees. And his heart rate, which Dross checked because she did not believe the number, was already coming back down toward something a resting person might show. He sat there for 11 minutes. Then he got up and went on toward the core, and he took a longer route the rest of the way, one that kept solid decks between himself and the middle where the worm still hunted, and he never went near it again. Hour 31. The tumble had brought a drifting radiation pocket across the only clear path forward, and he had known it was coming, Dross realized watching him wait. He had been reading the ship's rotation since the first hour, the slow regular period of its tumble, the way the loose things in it sighed toward one wall and then the other, and he had understood that the reactor's ghost drifted on that same cycle, and so he simply sat in a shielded junction and waited for the ship to turn the danger away from the door he needed. He waited 2 hours and 40 minutes for a gap he had calculated from nothing but the ship's own motion and the feel of it through the deck, and when the gap came he crossed, and the dosimetry the standby team pulled afterward showed he had taken almost nothing, less than a candidate in a rated suit would have accumulated just walking the halls. Hour 40. He reached a sealed compartment 2 decks above the core, and inside it, on a mounting the threll used for critical spares, he found the ship's cause of death. He did not know it was the cause of death, not at first. What he found was a coolant manifold, a single machined component the size of his torso, and what he saw when he ran his hands over it in the light of his second-to-last chemical tube was a hairline fracture pattern radiating from a bolt seat. The specific signature of a part that had been installed under torque it was never rated to bear. He had seen it 100 times in the outer belt. It was the kind of failure that killed platforms, a small wrong thing multiplied by pressure and time until the whole structure paid for it. He spent 40 minutes with that manifold. He traced the fracture. He read the machining marks. He worked out, alone, in the dark, in a dead ship a species not his own had built, why the ship had died. And then he did something that Dross, when she reached this segment, sat back from the console to consider, because it was the moment the proving stopped being about survival for her and started being about something she did not have a category for. He took the manifold with him. It weighed nearly as much as he did. He could not carry it and climb, so he did not carry it and climb. He lashed it to the salvage bar with strips he cut from his own belt using the bar's chisel edge worked back and forth against the alloy until it parted, and he dragged the thing behind him on a sling the last 2 decks to the core, adding a burden that would slow him and cost him, and might, if the clock ran close, cost him the whole attempt. Because he had decided that walking out alive was not by itself the thing he had come to do. Hour 52. He reached the core, and in the core, where the ship's dead reactor sat cold behind its shielding, and the structural spines met the central frame, Isaac Renner did the last thing the monitoring system flagged, and it flagged it because it did not have a routine for it. He found a bulkhead panel, a broad flat sheet of the Threll's hull alloy, and he pried it free, and he sat down in the dark with the salvage bar's chisel end, and he began to write. He carved, in the metal, in the careful blocky strokes of a man used to marking pipe and plate on a job where paper did not survive. He cut a full structural map of the freighter as he had traversed it, every deck he had crossed, every failed section, every flooded hold, the drift path of the radiation pocket keyed to the tumble cycle, the middle decks marked with a symbol he repeated 3 times so no one could miss it, where the worm still lived. And beside the map in a column he cut a survey of the ship's death, the fractured manifold, the overworked seat, the failure that had begun in one small wrong thing and finished by killing everyone aboard. He worked on it for 6 hours. Dross watched all 6, twice. He emerged from the derelict at hour 59 40 minutes before the clock expired, dragging a coolant manifold on a sling of his own belt and carrying a sheet of carved hull plate under one arm and the salvage bar in his free hand, moving at the same unremarkable pace he had carried through the door 2.5 days earlier. He was gray with cold and old with fatigue, and there was a shallow cut across the bridge of his nose that had scabbed sometime around hour 3. He did not look like a man who had done anything unusual. He looked like a man coming off a long shift. Overseer Dross met him at the recovery lock herself. This was not customary. It was not, in fact, something she had done in the 11 years she had overseen the proving, and her junior proctors noted it and said nothing. Isaac Renner set the carved plate down. He lowered the manifold to the deck with the care of a man setting down something valuable rather than something he was glad to be rid of. He straightened and he looked at the Osari overseer with the mild, unhurried attention of someone waiting to be told where to sign. 1 item, Dross said. She had meant to say something more measured. It was what came out. It was the one that did the most, Renner said. The standing record, she said, is 52 items and a complete survey. He looked at her for a moment, and then he crouched and turned the carved hull plate around so it faced her, and she looked down at 3 days of a man's crossing rendered in cut metal, at the map and the marked hazards and the column of failure analysis, and beside it on the deck, the manifold itself, the evidence, the actual dead heart of the ship he had gone in and diagnosed. I did a survey too, he said. Figured you'd want to know why the ship died. It's in the metal, but the short version's on the floor there. Somebody torqued that manifold past spec on the install. Wrong number on a work order, probably. 40 years later, everybody aboard's dead, and you're towing the hull around for tests. He said it without heat, the way a man reports a thing he has seen too many times to be angry about anymore. It wasn't the reactor, it was the paperwork. Dross looked at the plate, then at the pisifold, then at the man who was shivering now that he was still, and had not mentioned it, and clearly did not intend to. The bar, she said, because she found she genuinely needed to understand it. in a way that had nothing to do with the score. 100 items. Why only the bar? Isaac Renner considered the question with the seriousness of someone who had been asked it before by himself and had an answer ready that he had earned rather than invented. Everything else on that table does part of the job for you, he said. The suit keeps you warm so you don't have to think about the cold. The scout maps the room so you don't have to feel it. The medkit fixes what you break so you don't learn not to break it. Every one of those things is somebody else promising to catch you. He turned the bar once in his hand. A small unconscious motion, the way a person turns a thing they trust. The bar doesn't promise anything. It just makes me heavier where I need to be heavy and gives me a way to push on the world. Everything else is me. He paused, and when he went on his voice had gone quieter and carried the particular weight of a man who had spent 11 years in places where nobody was coming. Out where I work, the gear fails. It always fails. And the day it fails is the day you find out whether you were the tool the whole time or just the guy holding it. I already know which one keeps you alive. I'd rather not forget it in here. Dross was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up the carved plate. It was heavier than it looked. She turned it toward the light and read the first line he had cut. At the top, before the map, before the analysis, the thing he had apparently decided to record first, at hour 52, cold and exhausted with the clock running down. It was not a boast, and it was not a complaint. It was a single line of orientation, a technician's habit, the deck and heading and the time he had entered, marked so that whoever came after him would know where they were standing. She had seen 10,000 candidate records in her career. She had never seen one that began by thinking about the reader. She looked up. The review board convenes in 19 days, she said. I would like you to present this, not the score, the method. How you read the tumble to time the radiation gap. How you crossed the flood without a suit. And what you did in the cargo run at hour 22, with the vent. Because we have 3 centuries of records and no one has ever done that, and I would like it written down before you leave this facility in case you are the only person alive who knows how. Isaac Renner looked at her the way a man looks when he has walked into a test expecting to be judged and is instead being asked to teach. I can do that, he said. It's not complicated. Most of it's just paying attention to the thing that's trying to kill you instead of the gear that's supposed to stop it. He glanced down at the manifold, and reading the work order. Dross almost smiled, which was not a thing her species did easily or often or in front of junior staff. Get warm first, she said. There's a medical bay. Use it. That's not part of the evaluation. That's just so you don't die in my recovery lock after surviving my proving, which would be embarrassing for both of us. He nodded and picked up the bar and left the manifold and the carved plate where they sat. Because he understood correctly that they were no longer his to carry. He walked toward the medical bay at the same unhurried pace he had carried through 59 hours of a dead ship, and the junior proctors got out of his way without quite meaning to, and Overseer Dross watched him go. Then she keyed her comm and requested that the review board's schedule be cleared for a full presentation rather than a summary review. And because she was, above all, a thorough administrator of a 300-year-old institution, she had just watched a salvage technician quietly redefine. She opened a second channel and sent a formal query to the Human Outer Belt Authority, requesting the complete training and certification methodology used for their deep salvage riggers, because whatever it was those people were learning out there in the dark on the failing edge of their own territory, she had decided she wanted to understand it, and understand it well. The carved plate stayed on the recovery deck. The manifold sat beside it, the small wrong thing that had killed his ship, brought back into the light by a man who had gone in with less than anyone in 3 centuries and come out having seen more. 311 years of records, 1 salvage bar, and on a sheet of a dead ship's hull, cut by hand in the dark, the highest survey score the proving had ever registered, written first before anything else for whoever came next.